Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be bringing you my spoiler-filled review and discussion for Avengers Endgame. Now, I feel like you guys have probably had enough time to see the film by now, especially considering how big the opening weekend was. However, if you haven't seen the film, then you should probably check it out as soon as possible, and then you can always come back and watch this video after it's over. And in the meantime, you can also check out my non-spoiler review, which is available on the channel. However, for the rest of you guys who have seen the movie, or just want to find out what happens, I'm just going to briefly go over what happened within the film, while explaining what I liked, what I disliked, and my general thoughts on the MCU moving forward, because that's really a big question that's up in the air right now. So without further ado, let's get into this review. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you can see all of my content right away when it comes out. So Avengers Endgame is a film that can really be boiled down into three distinct acts, with Act 1 being the fallout from Avengers Infinity War and everyone recovering after the desolation of the snap. However, interestingly, it takes a big twist that I'm sure most fans didn't expect, when the Avengers are able to figure out the location of Thanos due to him using the stones once again. So within the first 10 to 15 minutes, the Avengers show up on the planet and fight Thanos and have him defeated. However, as Thanos reveals, it's not that easy, because he actually used the Infinity Gauntlet to destroy all of the stones. So automatically, this puts our characters in a very different position than we would have expected, as it seemed like going into this film, it was going to be more of a situation in which the Avengers rally together and build up an ultimate alliance of sorts so they can go after Thanos and try and take the gauntlet from him. However, in an interesting twist, that's actually denied of them, as Thanos ensures that they won't just be able to take the gauntlet back and undo what he has done. However, Thanos at this point is also kind of a dead man walking because of how damaging using the stones for such a powerful purpose was to his body. But that doesn't stop Thor from taking Thanos' advice and going for the head and killing him. And then we're immediately greeted with a text card on the screen, slowly revealing that 5 years have passed. Which again, I thought maybe the film would take place in the beginning 5 years later. I wasn't exactly expecting them to kill Thanos and then 5 years goes by. But either way, this is where our characters are in a situation where they're attempting to move on from everything that's happened. Captain America, for example, serves as a grief counselor, kind of like Falcon did in Winter Soldier, trying to help some people move on. And there's even a couple cameos here, one from Joe Russo, one of the directors of the film, and also another from Jim Starlin, the creator of Thanos, as well as the writer of the Infinity Gauntlet comic. But we see that the world is a lot different now. It's almost post-apocalyptic, as pretty much everything seems to be in disarray after half the world's population disappeared, which I'm not too surprised by considering how traumatic of an event that would have been. But the Avengers are in very different places at this point, with Black Widow kind of falling apart, as she seems to be like the de facto Nick Fury now. We see that the Hulk is now essentially Professor Hulk, in which Bruce Banner essentially embraced the Hulk and was able to use science to keep full control of his mind and all of his intelligence while also having the Hulk's body 24/7, which I think was a pretty good creative choice and something that seemed to be building to over the past several films that the Hulk has been in. And one of the things in this film that I actually predicted in a video that you can find on this channel. We also see that Tony Stark has married Pepper Potts and they now have a kid, which I think was a nice touch, especially considering that they actually foreshadowed this in Infinity War, and it helps to give his character more development by making him a father, and giving him more responsibilities and things he wants to protect. And Thor is also in a very different place, having gone through a different transformation of his own, and becoming what fans have dubbed Fat Thor, where Thor has essentially become a shut-in, and spends all of his time drinking and playing video games with Korg and Meek. And you know, I've seen a number of people online not liking this change in Thor's character, and some of them even going so far as to say that they think it ruined Thor and his development that we saw from Ragnarok into Infinity War. But I have to disagree, because at this point Thor has spent over 5 years blaming himself for everything that happened in Infinity War with the snap. After all, he caught Thanos off guard after he assembled his gauntlet, and was able to even land a blow on him with Stormbreaker. But as Thanos said, he should have gone for the head. And because he had to have the final final word and didn't decapitate Thanos when he had the chance, Thanos was able to enact his plan. So out of every one of the Avengers, Thor blamed himself the most. So even though he's a god, he's still been portrayed as a person. And it makes a lot of sense that a person like him could be lost in their own depression and turn to alcohol and eating and sealing yourself off from the rest of the world and becoming what he did in this film. And even though Thor does go through a character arc in the film, one of the things I liked is the fact that even come the end of the film, he didn't get back his washboard abs and he doesn't look like a bodybuilder anymore, because that isn't just something that's going to immediately change over the course of this film. And even though I almost expected it to happen, it would have been a little ridiculous if Thor donned his armor and suddenly all of his fat was gone. Plus, as a fan of The Big Lebowski, with it probably being my favorite Coen Brothers film, I really appreciated all of the references. But all of the main cast of Avengers give really good performances in this film. Chris Hemsworth, Robert Downey Jr., Mark Ruffalo, Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, and Jeremy Renner, who might have stood out more in this film than pretty much every other film he's been in thus far as Hawkeye. A character who often kind of gets pushed to the background, but he had some real emotional scenes during this film, such as the opening where we see his family get snapped away, and then the whole situation on Vormir with him and Black Widow, where one of them has to sacrifice themselves. But of course, this leads into the reintroduction of Paul Rudd as Ant-Man, who I also liked in this film, and the introduction of time travel to the MCU. And even though we have seen time turned back, or put into a loop in Doctor Strange with the Time Stone, or at the end of Infinity War when Thanos turns back time so that he could take the stone from Vision, we've definitely never seen it to this level, in which Ant-Man, Bruce Banner, and Tony Stark come together in order to create an essential time machine in which the characters go through the quantum realm and back in time to various points during the timeline, all in an effort to undo what Thanos has done. And of course, as they explain in the film, they can't simply go back in time and take the gauntlet from Thanos within the main timeline, or like kill him as a baby in order for him to have never existed and never actually do what he did with the Desolation, but rather, like in many other time travel stories, when they go back in time and they change something, it actually creates a separate branch reality. And so the plan that they come up with is essentially like a time heist, in which different teams of the Avengers go back to certain points in time when other movies in the MCU are taking place, so that they can acquire each of the separate stones and create their own gauntlet so they can do another snap and bring everyone back who Thanos snapped away. And this film heavily pulls from movies like Back to the Future 2, where we saw Marty McFly go back to the events of Back to the Future 1 and show us more of what's happening in the background during some of these scenes. So, for example, a team of the Avengers go back to the original Avengers movie during the Battle of New York, and we see that some other characters, like the Ancient One, played by Tilda Swinton, is actually there defending the Sanctum Sanctorum from an attack of the Chitauri. And there's a bunch of other funny moments that take place during this, such as when Captain America gets in the elevator with the SHIELD members who in Winter Soldier are revealed to be Hydra agents. And it seems like Cap is about to say the same line from what happened in Winter Soldier, then get ready to fight all of them at the same time. But then, in a funny reference to the comics, he leans over and talks to the SHIELD agent and whispers "Hail Hydra" into his ear, which allows him to take Loki's scepter. However, naturally, there are some complications along the way, as Cap has to fight his past self, and then the Hulk, who's angry that he had to take the stairs and there were so many stairs, bursts open the door and knocks the Tesseract out of Tony's hands, which goes directly into Loki's hands, who uses it to escape, which no doubt messes up that entire timeline. Although I guess it could explain the upcoming Loki series on Disney+. Maybe it'll take place there. However, the biggest complication would have to be Thanos himself, because when Nebula and War Machine go back to the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie so that they can take the Power Stone, somehow the technology within Nebula is connected to the same network that the past Nebula is using, and so Thanos is able to see the memories of the present Nebula and what the Avengers were planning, as well as his own death, through his past Nebula. And while this was a little contrived, considering how likely was it that all of this would even happen, and it doesn't seem like Nebula really warned anyone about Thanos being there as well as her during the planning stages because of this incredibly complex plan where everything needs to go perfectly fine in order for them to succeed. But nonetheless, it was an interesting way for them to re-involve Thanos in the story, considering that the main Thanos was killed earlier in the film. And naturally, considering how big of a deal Thanos was in Infinity War, with it basically being his movie, and serving as a version of the Thanos quest from the comics, where he assembled all of the stones before the Infinity Gauntlet event, it would have been really anticlimactic and pretty underwhelming if that was the end for him during the first act of the film. But of course, all of this factors into a big way in the third act. But before we get there, we also have Tony Stark and Captain America go back in time to the 1970s so that Stark would be able to get the Tesseract back from S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters. And during this, there's a great scene between Tony Stark and his father Howard Stark when he was younger, basically around the same age that Tony Stark would have been in the main timeline. And they have a whole discussion about how Tony's mother is pregnant with him, and basically his dad is overwhelmed by the idea and doesn't exactly know what to do. And I really like this scene because it helped to further contextualize Howard Stark in Tony's eyes, and have a real adult conversation with his father, who's long dead in Tony's timeline. And plus, it allows Tony, as a father now himself, to give advice on fatherhood to his own father. So it was a pretty great scene across the board. However, the mission to retrieve the Soul Stone doesn't really go as smoothly, because as we found out in Infinity War, a sacrifice has to be made and a soul must be exchanged for a soul in order to attain the Soul Stone. And so we have a scene in which Hawkeye and Black Widow get into a fight to decide who will sacrifice themselves for the stone, essentially racing to jump over the cliff. And at first I figured that Hawkeye would probably be the one to go over, considering that they would get the gauntlet eventually, and I figured he would probably be brought back and reunited with his family. Instead, what ends up happening is that Black Widow attaches him to the side of the cliff at the last moment, and then essentially lets herself go and trades her life so that he can get the stone. And it was a pretty sad moment that directly echoed the scene with Thanos and Gamora. And they even have a nearly identical shot of Black Widow's body on the ground. However, I would say overall that I prefer the version with Thanos and Gamora, which felt a lot more emotionally impactful. And I understand that they had to kill at least one Avenger off during this trip, considering the fact that they needed to establish the stakes and just how important this action was, and there was no other real way for them to get the Soul Stone. Although it is fortunate that they picked the two Avengers who love one another to retrieve it, considering that if they sent Thor and Hulk, chances are it might not have worked out. But as we find out later in the film, this sacrifice is actually permanent, because someone who gives their soul for the Soul Stone is unable to be brought back even with the other stones. So even though the Infinity Gauntlet should realistically make its wielder omnipotent and allow them to literally do anything, I guess in this case Gamora and Black Widow simply can't be brought back to life using it. Although I think that there still is a chance of their resurrection, which I'll talk about shortly. But of course, the Avengers are able to make it back to the present and assemble their own Infinity Gauntlet, which at first I thought that maybe Thor would be the one to wield, considering that he blamed himself the most for what happened, and it would essentially be by his hand that he would be reversing everything. However, due to the damage that's inflicted upon the person using the gauntlet, it makes sense that you give it to Hulk, who's not only incredibly powerful, but also has a healing factor on the level of Wolverine. Although it almost kind of seems like they forget about that after this happens. But either way, Hulk uses it to also snap his fingers and undo the desolation that Thanos caused. And this leads into the epic final act that, like I described in my non-spoiler review, is like a combination of the fights from Return of the King mixed with Return of the Jedi, only with superheroes involved. Because as the other Avengers are unaware, the Nebula that came back from the past is actually the past Nebula who is still on Thanos' side. And using the Pym particles that they stole from the present Nebula, she was able to bring Thanos' ship, which contained all of his armies, to the present, where they immediately attacked the Avengers compound. And at first I thought that maybe at least one of the Avengers would have died during the scene, especially Ant-Man, who was literally standing feet away from a massive explosion, but all of them ended up surviving, which is fine because it led to the epic fight, in which the Avengers fight Thanos and his armies. And of course, there are so many epic moments that take place during this, such as Thor dual wielding Mjolnir and Stormbreaker against Thanos. And of course, the big crowd favorite scene that was teased all the way back in Age of Ultron, when Captain America picks up Thor's hammer and starts using it against Thanos. And with a combination of that and his shield, he actually does pretty well at first. Although considering the fact that Thanos doesn't have the Infinity Gauntlet, he still does really well here, getting the better of Thor, Captain America, and the others who are fighting him, and even destroying Cap's shield, which is something he also did in the Infinity Gauntlet comic. However, my favorite moment of this fight happened when it seemed like all was lost. When suddenly a bunch of Doctor Strange portals opened up, and all of the heroes that were killed in the decimation emerged from them, with Black Panther, the Winter Soldier, Falcon, Scarlet Witch, and all the rest showed up to fight. And at this moment, when everyone joins the fight, reminded me a lot of the airport fight from Civil War, when it truly felt like a big comic book event come to life on the screen. Although you can multiply that by like 100. And one of my other favorite moments has to be when Scarlet Witch comes face to face with Thanos. And this version of Thanos says, "Oh, I don't even know who you are." And then she's like, "Oh, but you will." And she proceeds to dominate him, and is pretty much the only character in the movie who beats him one-on-one. And he has to use his ship to attack the battlefield just so he can break free of her power. And then Captain Marvel shows up, and she even gets a couple cool moments, with the first one being her destroying Thanos' ship, and then helping to get the gauntlet away from Thanos, and having kind of a funny exchange with Spider-Man. Although all of those concerns that I had about her beating Thanos and taking the gauntlet for herself were put to rest, as she attempted to fight Thanos and take the gauntlet until he took the Power Stone and put it into his other fist, and then punched her so hard that it knocked her out and kept her out of the film until towards the very end, which was definitely appreciated by the audience. But speaking of the end of this fight came when it once again appeared that Thanos had won, as he had taken hold of all the stones and put them within his gauntlet. And then as Thanos went to snap, once again saying, "I am inevitable," just as he did before he was killed in the beginning of the film, nothing happened, as it was revealed that Iron Man had taken all of the stones out of the gauntlet at the last second and put them into his Iron Man hand. And then as the stones were wreaking havoc on his body and dealing incredible damage, he had an epic final line of, "I am Iron Man," and then snapped his fingers, which dusted all of Thanos' army. And Thanos, being the character that he is in these movies, sat down very reminiscent to when he sat down at the end of Infinity War, realizing what had happened and letting it sink in as he also turned to dust. Much like a certain other bald villain from another long-running franchise, who also possessed a powerful magical artifact. And ultimately, due to the damage that the gauntlet inflicts on your body, Tony Stark ended up sacrificing his life. And after this, they have a great funeral scene, in which they show his original arc reactor from the first Iron Man that Pepper had repurposed for him into a plaque, with the words, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart," floating in the lake outside of his home. And then they had a great single shot as they pulled back from that lake to show all of the different characters that Tony Stark had had an impact on throughout the course of the MCU. And there were so many cameos in the scene, just like during the rest of the movie, including not only the Avengers, but other characters like Happy Hogan, Thunderbolt Ross, and even the kid from Iron Man 3. But of course, the last person they showed was Nick Fury, who at the end of the original Iron Man introduced the Avengers Initiative and kicked off the entire cinematic universe. So I think this was a really satisfying conclusion for the Iron Man character in these movies. And after this, Captain America also gets his own conclusion, as he goes back in time to return the various stones, which would have been cool to see them elaborate on, especially him meeting Red Skull on Vormir. But either way, they go to bring him back after about 5 seconds have passed and nothing happens. And at first I thought, oh, maybe this is gonna be set up for the next film, or the next phase in which they're gonna try and rescue Captain America. But instead, Bucky and Falcon turn around to see an old man sitting on a bench, who is revealed to be Captain America, who actually went back in time and married Peggy Carter, living his own life in another timeline, before returning to the present. And he did so in order to pass the torch and to pass on the mantle of Captain America to Falcon by giving him the shield. And I know that some people are also conflicted over this because they feel like maybe Bucky should have been the next Captain America, and that's the direction I thought that they were going in, especially after Black Panther, when they had removed all of that programming from his mind. But as we've seen in the comics, Falcon also became Captain America there, and I think it makes sense within the course of their story that he would be one of the people to take up the mantle. Whether he's going to remain Falcon or he's going to rename himself Captain America is really up in the air, and also is the question of, did Steve go back to that other timeline, or is he going to remain around in the main timeline as old Steve and give Falcon and the others advice, which is something I'm interested to see in the future. But this scene for me really sums up what this film is about, giving a conclusion to the original Avengers and the original saga of the MCU, and also passing the torch on to the next generation. While it wasn't a perfect movie, as some things don't entirely make sense, especially in regards to the time travel, some threads go unaddressed or unresolved, and some of the humor and character choices don't always work perfectly, and overall I'd probably say that I prefer the original comic book version. I feel like this film did what it set out to accomplish, giving us a satisfying conclusion for characters like Tony Stark and Captain America, and giving us the ultimate payoff that the entire MCU is built up to for 11 years and 22 films. But what about the MCU moving forward? Where can they even go from here? Well, no doubt they're going to introduce more new heroes such as Shang-Chi, who's been talked about a number of times by Kevin Feige, and with the acquisition of Fox, they're no doubt going to start implementing some of the characters that they owned in the past and putting them into the MCU. Although Feige has said that it'll be a while before the X-Men come in, I won't be surprised if we see Galactus, the Silver Surfer, Doctor Doom, and some of these other big characters that were Fox-owned being introduced over the course of the next phase. But of course, there's the problem with escalation, which films like this always have, and is now being referred to as the Thanos problem for the MCU, which is when you go to Thanos as your first true main antagonist that tied all of these films and phases together, someone who was essentially omnipotent when he had the gauntlet and destroyed half of all life in the universe, what can really top that? Do they go to somebody like the Beyonder, Mikaboshi, or someone along those lines? Or are they going to start to go smaller and then slowly build up to another big villain once again? And if they do go smaller, are the audience going to buy that these smaller threats can really be a threat to our heroes after they fought Thanos? And another thing is, are we going to get more Avengers movies, or maybe they going to do something like the New Avengers, or just a bunch of separate smaller teams, like they teased with Thor and the Guardians of the Galaxy, which might be the Asgardians of the Galaxy. And speaking of them, like I mentioned earlier, what are they going to do with Gamora and Black Widow? Are they truly going to stay dead, or is perhaps a character like Adam Warlock, who was teased in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, going to finally show up in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and then use his unique connection to the Soul Stone to maybe go inside of it and rescue them? I think that could definitely make for an interesting movie. But I guess the biggest question is, will fans still care after Endgame? After everything is built up to this big final climactic film, which isn't really the climax at all, will audiences still be able to invest in each of these other individual Marvel movies, or will the popularity and the investment start to fall off? Will more and more people start to tune out because they've already seen something that was built up for so long, and they're anticipating that any future phases or any future heroes simply won't live up to this? That's another question which waits to be seen, but I know for me personally, if I were to stop watching the movies right here, this would serve as a satisfying conclusion. And while I no doubt will see these Marvel movies as they come out, because I'm still a fan of the Marvel franchise and have been since before the MCU, I'm not sure if it'll ever truly recapture the magic of the Infinity Saga. But I guess all of that just waits to be seen, and I'll no doubt be talking more about the future of the MCU in other videos to come. So let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. What did you think of Avengers Endgame? And what were some of your favorite moments? Let me know down below. Also, if you're new to this channel, then don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so that you can see all of my videos right away when they come out. And if you like this video, then make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.